welcome to Cowboy Up with your host, Ron Wilson.
Howdy folks, welcome to Cowboy Up, a celebration of the Kansas Cowboy. I'm Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. I'll be your host. Today we're in for a treat. On our Singer Showcase, we're going to hear from Jeff Davidson, a talented Western musician and historian, and the president of the Kansas chapter of the Western Music Association. We'll also hear from Dr. Jim Hoy, who's going to tell us about the cowboy culture of Kansas. And we'll sneak in some cowboy poetry as well. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Today in our segment of the cowboy culture of Kansas, we're honored to have Dr. Jim Hoy. Dr. Hoy is a professor of English at Emporia State University. He graduated from Kansas State University and got his PhD from the University of Missouri at Columbia. Jim was reared on a stock ranch near Cassidy, Kansas, and is a working cowboy as well as an outstanding scholar who's published more than 14 books himself. Jim, one of my favorite stories I've heard you tell is about how you were finishing your graduate studies, but also still involved in ranch work and competition. Would you tell us about that?
Sure. My wife and I spent 4 years in Columbia, Missouri when I was getting my PhD, and during that time we rented a pasture near town and kept our horses there and bought steers in the spring, sold them in the fall, and also went to some of the little rodeos around in that area. And one of my favorite memories from my time there is the night I graduated and got my PhD, and then the very next night went to a little town called Williamsburg, just east of Columbia, and won the calf roping. Yeah.
And you're proud of both?
Proud of both of them, you bet.
You're a true cowboy. Jim, you are a real student of Kansas cowboy history and Western history. Tell us about the role of the cowboy in the development of the history of Kansas and the role of Kansas in creating the history of the cowboy.
Yeah, Kansas was instrumental in creating the cowboy. Without Kansas, we would not have a cowboy. Texas had the cattle, Kansas had the cow towns. The drives from Texas to Kansas is what created the cowboy. I like to say that the cowboy was born out of the dust of the old Chisholm Trail. There had been men and boys, primarily men and boys, working livestock all over the world for centuries, but none of them turned into this very distinctive type, folk type of the American cowboy. And that occurred in those trail drives. And in fact, Abilene, Kansas wasn't the first cow town, not the first cow town in Kansas. That was Baxter Springs. First cow town after the Civil War trail drives, 1866 was Sedalia, Missouri. But it was Abilene that really set the pattern.
We use the term cowboy as an overarching term to describe those who work with livestock today, but you explained that in the old days there were differences between drovers, herders.
That's right. In fact, the term cowboy was not applied to these men and boys that drove the cattle, worked the cattle until probably the early 1870s. If you drove cattle to market from Texas to Kansas, you were a drover. If you herded those cattle on those ranches, you were a herder. Herders and drovers, those two elements of the work, the lifestyle emerged to create the cowboy. The cowboy, as I say, born in the dust of the old Chisholm Trail. That began in 1867 when Joe McCoy, realizing that Missouri had outlawed the importation, the driving of Texas Longhorns into that state. They didn't like them because the Longhorns brought death with them. They were immune to this Spanish fever, but the local cattle caught it and died. And Missouri passed laws you couldn't bring in cattle, Texas cattle. So Joe McCoy at Abilene got the idea of setting up cattle pens at Abilene and bringing Texas cattle there, and that's really what created the American cowboy.
Stay with us. We'll be back for more on the cowboy culture of Kansas. This is our Singer Showcase. We're mighty pleased today to have Jeff Davidson with us. Jeff is an outstanding musician, a longtime extension agent, now watershed specialist for K-State Research and Extension, and a great fan of Western music and a great performer and student of Western history. Jeff, how did you get started doing Western cowboy music?
Well, I sort of grew up with it. My dad did some cowboy poetry actually, and as well as a lot of cowboy singing. But what really got me into it, I guess, was asked from the Flint Hill Overland Wagon Train to come out and start entertaining around their campfire several years ago, actually in '85. And so since that time, I've been doing singing and at campfires and other places for that matter, and taking the Western songs and Western music to folks.
That wagon train's no longer active, but I know you're president of the Kansas chapter of the Western Music Association, and that group is very active.
Yes, we do have a nice chapter of the Western Music Association here in Kansas, and we've been doing several events, and we have our meetings, and we've sponsored several events, as you know, because cowboy poetry is part of our Western Music Association.
Would you play us a couple of songs?
Sure, be glad to do that. Well, the cowboy in Kansas did arise from the dust of the old Chisholm Trail. And the old Chisholm Trail is a very old song that actually was sung as cowboys came up the trail. And there many verses have been written to this song over time. You'll kind of see as I do a few of them that verses could be added quite simply. And so cowboys would do that at nighttime right before they hit the sack for the evening. And so this is one called The Old Chisholm Trail, a very old song. Well, come along, boys, and listen to my tale. I'll tell you of my trouble on the old Chisholm Trail. Come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. Well, I woke one morning on the old Chisholm Trail with the rope in my hand and a cow by the tail. Come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. On a $10 horse and a $40 saddle, I started out herding them longhorn cattle. Come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. It's early in the morning and it looks like rain. I left my slicker in the wagon again. Come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. Well, there's ants in the butter and flies in the meat. If your waddies are hungry, get up here and eat. Come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. Well, it's beans and bacon most every day. I'd just as soon eat prairie hay. Come tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay, yippee-yay, come a tie-yi, yippee, yippee-yay. Cowboys coming up the trail came to Kansas for the most part. Kansas was where the railheads were at, and that's when the cattle got on the trains and headed to Chicago. However, some of those cattle would go on to the northwest. Keep in mind there were miners in Colorado as well as the Black Hills, and they needed beef. Also, some of the cattle went to establish herds into the northwest parts, such as Wyoming or Montana. I happen to like this song. It's called Get Along Little Dogies. It kind of gives you a little bit of the history or the life of the steer on the trail. As I was out walking one morning for pleasure, I spied a young puncher just a-riding along. His hat was thrown back and his spurs were a-jingling. As he approached, he was singing this song. Whoopie-tie-yi-yo, you get along, you little dogies. It's your misfortune and none of my own. Whoopie-tie-yi-yo, you get along, you little dogies. You know that Wyoming will be your new home. It's early in the spring when we round up the dogies. We mark them and we brand them and we bob off their tails. Round up the horses, load up the chuck wagon, then throw the doggies out on the long trail. Whoopie-tie-yi-yo, you get along, you little doggies. It's your misfortune and none of my own. Whoopie-tie-yi-yo, you get along, you little doggies. Know that Wyoming will be your new home. show you till you are ready for Idaho. Whippity-yi-yo, get along, you little doggies. It's your misfortune and none of my own. Whippity-yi-yo, you get along, you little doggies. Know that Wyoming will be your new home. Oh, you'll be soup for Uncle Sam's engines. It's beef, beef, beef. I hear them cry. You get along, you get along, you get along, you little doggies. You're gonna be beef stew by and by. Whippity-yi-yo, get along, you little doggies. It's your misfortune and none of my own. Whippity-yi-yo, you get along, you little doggies. Know that Wyoming will be your new home.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Jeff Davidson on our Singer Showcase. Thanks for joining us on Cowboy Up, a celebration of the Kansas cowboy. Special thanks to our guests Jim Hoy and Jeff Davidson. I'm your host, Ron Wilson, Poet Laureate. Remember, folks, if there hadn't been a Kansas, there might not have been a cowboy. Happy trails.